This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Welcome to the Most Painful Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hoppe. Well, it's fall of 2024, and we are starting Season 5. I'd like to thank you, the listeners from Canada, US, Europe, UK, Australia, for your support of this show. Your feedback has helped develop the show and define the topics that are important to you. On Season 4, we had some great topics. We had talked to Dr. Sun about arthritis. We also talked to Dr. Martin Gabala about the benefits of high-intensity interval training and how it can help with your health. And if you want to know how to conquer chronic pain, then listen to Dr. Andrea Ferlin in Season 4, where she provides 8 steps to conquer chronic pain. And she will be on the show in Season 5, and there'll be many more great topics to help you with your quality of health. The topic we're going to talk about today is important not just for veterans, but also for clinicians, researchers, and for people who may know a veteran. Many of you may not know that veterans, in order for them to access health benefits for their injuries, they need to have an approved pension condition with Veterans Affairs Canada. And understanding the process can be very daunting. Today, I'm joined by Harold Leduc, a former Veteran Affairs Review and Appeal Board member who adjudicated over 5,000 cases. He's been an expert witness for both Parliamentary and Senate hearing committees, as well as an advisor to other government officials on veterans' benefits and veterans legislation. I would say Harold is a person who has proven in the veteran community to have the most in-depth knowledge of the facts and history of veterans' benefits and legislation. Harold, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So, Harold, let's talk a little bit about the process that veterans need to follow. And I'm going to put another question in there is, why would this be important not just for veterans and clinicians, but also for researchers as well?
Well, good question, Tom. The disability application process is a 2-step process. First of all, it's a process. It's not an event. So the veteran makes an application to the minister by contacting Veterans Affairs. However they do that, whether by phone or email or whatever source they prefer. And in return, they'll get an application form that specifically goes to their complaint or their perceived disability. Now, once they receive the form, then on the form itself, and this happened in 1995, where they changed the application process to make it quicker for Veterans Affairs to say yes or no, understanding that veterans had an appeal and review process to fall back on. They did that for the World War II veterans who were aging. Now, when they get the application form, there's somewhat of confusion because the first part of the application process is the entitlement part, where a veteran is seeking entitlement. And there's 2 sets of entitlements that he can achieve if the claim is favorable. The first one is entitlement to treatment, and the second one is entitlement to an assessment to determine the amount of disability that the veteran has. So it's a 2-step process, and it's a legal process. And but the information that's required by Veterans Affairs asks the doctor to speak to both parts of the process, the entitlement and the assessment, which is somewhat confusing. And in my role as an adjudicator with the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, I remember some of my colleagues using assessment information to deny entitlement claims because it was there, so they felt they could use it, not understanding that it's a 2-step process and one should be kept separate from the other.
So does this, I guess, like you said, leads to the confusion for medical practitioners and also for the veteran. So as you said, the veterans will, and I guess we can talk about the clinician's role and researcher's role maybe a little later on, but the veteran now takes that application form to their respective doctor. They fill out the form. from what you're saying. And then that goes off back to Veterans Affairs to be adjudicated. Is that correct?
Yes. And it's confusing for the doctors and whoever's filling out those forms because the Veterans Affairs is still working on it, guidelines and policies that were around when the department had its own medical system. So there's different language, and the language is very important. For example, a civilian doctor may look at something and say, this is possibly connected to service, meaning that it's a positive and that it's positively connected to service, where Veterans Affairs may look at it and say, well, we don't work off of a possibility, we'll work off of a, sorry, I'm missing the word here, but the idea is that the language is not the same. And federal court has ruled that the standard of evidence for veterans' claims is beyond a mere possibility. So as long as there's a possibility, it should result in a favorable claim. So it's difficult. It's difficult for the veterans don't really understand what these forms are all about typically. They're not used to that kind of thing. But the medical professionals have difficulty because of the language. What a lot of veterans don't understand is that when they go to see their doctor to get these claims filled out, they should look on the Veterans Affairs website and find the Veterans Affairs Entitlement Eligibility Guidelines, which will have a chapter on the disability they're going after. And they should take that chapter to their doctor and say, here is the language that they're looking for. And they should also have a copy of the chapter of Table of Disabilities, which is for the assessment part, to take to the doctor to fill out the form saying, here is the language Veterans Affairs use. So that way there won't be any conflict in language and everybody's speaking from the same song sheet.
Yeah, so what you're saying, a couple of things came out of that is one, the example using possibility. For our audience, they may not understand that in order for a veteran to have a approved pension condition, it has to be related to time in service. So what you're talking about is when a doctor writes down the possibility of it relating to service, it may not be definitive enough for the adjudicator. I guess that's one question or kind of one comment I got from what you were saying. And I guess the other thing too is I like the idea that the veteran should go on to Veterans Affairs website and look at the tables of disability and as well as the eligibility criteria you were saying, and actually take that to their doctor so that the doctor can actually write to the language in order to be successful. Because as the audience may not know, the military does not have workers' compensation. So when people get hurt, you can correct me on this, Harold, if I'm wrong, but my understanding is Veterans Affairs is really, in a sense, what is there for us should we get injured. And if the approval is not successful, then the veteran then doesn't get the benefits that they require. So it's important that everything is filled out properly and so that the adjudicator in Veterans Affairs can do their job properly and have all the information they require to do it. Is that correct?
That's right. Veterans Affairs is actually government's and Veterans Affairs adjudication process is based on workers' compensation principles. But the entitlement for disability benefit is based on a couple of things, and one is for people that serve overseas. Then, as long as something arose out of that service overseas, then they're entitled to a benefit. But those that didn't serve overseas, that are putting in a claim that came from a sports day or something, then they have a little bit more of a challenge to prove that it was attributed to military service. Veterans Affairs is the Workers' Compensation Board for the national defense and veterans. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the reason why this system is set up is because veterans are not insurable. Veterans work under the conditions of unlimited liability, meaning they don't have a right not to work at risk, where everybody in the public service, including the RCMP, they all have a right to work at, or a right to refuse to work at risk, and are covered under the labor code. Military veterans are not. And so that's why you have a different system, because if that weren't true, then military members and veterans would be covered under the same disability legislation as the public service.
So what I'm hearing you say is that, there are a number of things that come out of that. I guess one is the language, so that Veterans Affairs employees can actually do their job to, or be able to have the information to make the proper decision. But also, there is no limited right of refusal in the service. So that sets up a different process versus other public service entities or first responders. So because of that, the veteran has to, when you're talking about overseas versus an injury at a base, for example, or on a training exercise, the overseas one, from what I heard you say, seems to be easier to support that injury happened in service, thus allowing the veteran to have benefits. And I think there are different benefits too compared to an injury in Canada. You can correct me on that. Versus someone who had an injury in Canada. So why is there a difference? I mean, an injury is an injury in service. Doesn't matter where you are.
That's been a long struggle. They had many discussions about it during World War II when they were setting up the World War II Veterans Charter. It's more palatable to the citizens that veterans that serve overseas get better benefits than those that serve in Canada. I don't know why, because to be able to work overseas, you have to train in Canada. And if you're going to train for war, you have to simulate war. So it's just sometimes as dangerous, and perhaps not the intensity or the danger level, but it's still risky. So if you're putting in for a claim and you were injured, say in Afghanistan, you don't have to prove that you didn't have any problems before you went to Afghanistan. If your continuity of complaints or your evidence starts from when you were in Afghanistan, then it arose out of your service in Afghanistan, right? So you could have banged up your knee while you're playing soccer on a sports afternoon 5 years before going to Afghanistan, but there's been no problems. You've had no complaints. And yet you went to the MIR to get it checked out. They may be a record of that, but if there's no continuity of complaints, then you go to Afghanistan and you bang up your knee or you get your knee shot or something, then the continuity of complaints, if it goes from there, will definitely show the adjudicators, or should show the adjudicators, that it arose out of the special duty area service or overseas service. With respect to the people that serve in Canada and are injured in Canada, it's more of an insurance principle. I'm going to get this wrong. I will have to. I'm going to eliminate use words insurance and compensation. But what it is you have to prove that your injury is solely related to military service. That's the difference. You play for a civilian baseball team, you injure your knee, and then you come to work and injure it again while you're in service, then they will, the possibility, if you complain since you injured your knee outside of service, the possibility would be that they would take a portion of that entitlement away because it was a pre-existing condition.
Yeah, so that's the difference in a sense, is that overseas seems like it's more cut and dry, where if you get injured here, then you have to prove that. But when someone gets out of the service, and we know that, chronic pain is twice that in veterans than it is in the general population. And that's due just to the nature of the job, but we're not 100% sure. That's why a lot of research is being done on that. But if someone gets out of the service and they start to have like osteoarthritis and they can link it back to service, like how does that process work?
Yeah, glad you asked that question. It's interesting, and that's where we go back to the entitlement eligibility guidelines. For example, I'm gonna go back first. The premise behind the table of disabilities is to spell out from the current medical knowledge what type of disability, what Veterans Affairs can expect when a veteran gets a claim for a certain disability. But it's built by medical professionals. The entitlement eligibility guidelines are also built on studies from a wide range, including the medical community. But the disability assessment has always included pain as part of the financial part and treatment part that they decide on. Now they've separated that somewhat because if you have real severe pain or chronic pain, then there's different benefits you can apply for. That's happened since the lump sum. But pain is an indicator, and especially with osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis, according to the entitlement eligibility guidelines, can take up to 25 years to develop after an injury. The entitlement eligibility guidelines should also tell you that cancer can take up to 65 years to develop after environmental exposures. So let's go back to the osteoarthritis. You can have osteoarthritis evidenced by an X-ray, but it may not be symptomatic. So in the Veterans Affairs adjudicated world, that's not a disability. The osteoarthritis or X-ray has to be accompanied by some kind of symptoms like pain or lesser degree of range of motion. Now, mostly the assessment guidelines, the table of disabilities, will measure joints by the degree of range of motion, yet the veteran could be suffering from more pain as a symptom than degree of range of motion. All that to say that the process is, there are measures built in the process to ensure that veterans are covered even as they age somewhat.
As long as they can tie it back to service, right? I mean...
that's right. You have to tie it back to an incident.
Yeah. And does that incident have to be recorded on your medical file? You know, we know in the service, a lot of us, especially in the combat arms, we're exposed to a lot of different toxins in service, but we're not writing that down or going to the UMS and writing that down. So if someone's in their late 60s and they get cancer, it sounds to me like that one might be a little more challenge to get eligibility versus osteoarthritis, for example.
Another good question, because in the Pension Act, which has been around since 1919 and was superseded by Part 3 of the new Veterans Charter in 2006, but in both pieces of legislation under disability, there are presumptions written into the language. Now, for instance, one of the presumptions is if you're exposed to environmental toxins. Another presumption is if you're in transport, you're going to get banged around. So there's a number of presumptions, but those presumptions don't mean that you don't need evidence. It just means that you still have to prove by evidence that it was related to service, of course, unless it would happen overseas. But the presumption should help the claim go more in your favor. That's one of those incidences about the benefit of the doubt that they're given to veterans. That and the presumptions and the definition of how the evidence should be interpreted.
Yeah. So, like, if someone, for example, had a TBI or something in service, or, banging your head off the armored personnel carrier, and they start to develop something later on in life, then that, in its sense, would be a presumption, right? That the type of service they were in, this is what they're exposed to, so it would be easier for them to justify their injury.
Yes, and something that's very important and federal court ruled on in one of the cases on McAllister is that Veterans Affairs policy does not supersede evidence that was taken at the time. So, example, not all veterans like to report that they're injured for many, many reasons, including career progression, on and on. However, I advise veterans to keep it, or military members to keep a journal and get somebody to witness it. The entry in your journal about an injury you may have had, and get them to write a statement for you. Because that was one of the things that federal court said, is that, the statement that the veteran who was with him wrote has far more weight than any policy or anything that tries to supersede it. So veterans should always keep a journal. They should get statements from people that were around at the time, and that is good evidence. So it doesn't have to be recorded.
Yeah, we're getting to the end of the show here, and I mean, there's probably a lot more to dig into. And I think as much as it's important for veterans, it's also important for clinicians, because if they want, I've had clinicians talk to me who struggle because their veterans are not being able to get the required approved pension condition, so they can't provide treatment, or they can, but it's a cost to the veteran, or however that works. So clinicians need to understand too that this is a different language, like you said, and that if they want the best outcome for their patient to be able to get those benefits so that they can treat them, to really look at the language that Veterans Affairs wants so that it's done correctly the first time around. And I guess maybe we'll have to have another podcast or another episode, maybe in season 6. We'll have you back and we can dive into the review and appeal process when veterans aren't successful in the very first one. So is that a good summary that I just put in there just for the initial stages?
Yes, Tom, and I would add to that that the clinicians also should be looking at the table, not the table of disabilities, but the entitlement eligibility guidelines. And why I say that is because although a person might have osteoarthritis of the left knee, there are other conditions that will come from that, but the entitlement eligibility guidelines will tell the clinician what is included in the treatment, or how to define that knee. And I know the clinicians have been frustrated for years over Veterans Affairs, the information they have to provide. For instance, the word maintenance. A massage therapist or a physiotherapist can't use the word maintenance because Veterans Affairs doesn't pay benefits for maintenance. Yet they want different language, right? So yeah, they should refer to those two resources as well.
Yeah, I think that's important for both the clinician and the veteran. So it is kind of a team approach. And like I said, when we are at the end of the show, but I think we could talk more about this when we start talking about the review and appeal process, because I think that's important for people to understand. I've had both clinicians and veterans, when they're struggling, saying, what's our next step? So I think that would be a nice segue into the next show. So Harold, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate what we talked about today. And I think it'll be helpful for people to understand how, kind of what the best approach is to be successful in that process. So thank you for being on the show, Harold.
Oh, you're welcome, Tom. And if any of your viewers or listeners have any questions or whatever, they can put them through you. You know how to get hold of me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can do that. That's great. So on our next show, we're going to be talking about how to calm your nervous system. So that'll be a very interesting one. I'm looking forward to that one as well. So for feedback about our show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Once again, thank you to the guest, Harold, and for the audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.